In America's dark history, she became a tragic symbol of generations of taboo. Her wedding day came before her first period, a bride traded like property in a family tree that folded back on itself too many times to count. The most inbred bride in America wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was the culmination of a legacy that many would prefer to forget. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy fog clinging to Whitford Valley as Clara Walker stood on her family's sagging porch. Her dress, yellowed with age and memory, hung loosely on her thin 9-year-old frame. The garment wasn't hers originally. Like most things in Clara's life, it had been passed down, carrying the weight of generations before her. Around her, relatives gathered in eerie silence. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, all bearing the Walker name, stood with eyes deliberately averted from what they collectively knew was wrong, but none dared to challenge. Their faces wore the same distant expression, a practiced neutrality that Clara had learned to recognize as fear disguised as tradition. "Stand up straight," her mother whispered, adjusting Clara's collar with trembling fingers. The woman wouldn't meet her daughter's gaze, focusing instead on smoothing invisible wrinkles from the fabric. Elijah Walker, her cousin and would-be husband, waited at the bottom of the steps with arms folded across his chest and jaw set like stone. At 32, he embodied the valley's rules, traditions older than the weathered fence posts surrounding their property. His eyes, cold and determined, surveyed the gathering with a stare that brooked no dissent. Everyone knew his role as the family's enforcer, the one who maintained order when whispers of change threatened their isolated world. It's time," someone murmured, and Clara felt a gentle push forward. The wooden steps creaked beneath her feet as she descended, each one bringing her closer to Elijah. The morning dew had soaked through her worn shoes, but the chill in her bones came from something deeper than the Appalachian mountain air. Behind her, Clara could hear the shuffle of feet as the family fell into formation. This ceremony wasn't the official wedding, that would come later at the small church, but rather the family's private acknowledgement of the arrangement, a tradition carried out for generations in Whitford Valley. Elijah extended his hand, calloused and rough from years of labor. "Come, Clara," he said, his voice neither kind nor cruel, simply matter of fact. The same tone he might use when instructing her to fetch water or tend the stove. As their fingers touched, Clara noticed how her small hand disappeared completely within his grasp. She glanced up at the surrounding hills, their peaks obscured by the clinging fog. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay a different world, one she had only heard about in whispers and fragments of overheard conversations. The family began to move toward the house for the gathering meal, a procession of silence and submission that had played out countless times before. The ancient words slipped from Reverend Simmons' lips like a tired prayer, barely audible over the wind's mournful howl. Clara Walker stood rigid in her yellowed dress, her small fingers trembling as they clutched a wilted wildflower bouquet. The ceremony unfolded beneath the sprawling oak that had witnessed generations of Walker unions, its gnarled branches casting spidery shadows across the gathering. Clara's eyes darted toward the distant hills, drinking in their misty blue silhouette one last time. Those peaks had always represented something beyond her reach: freedom, possibility, escape. Now they seemed to be retreating, fading into a world she would never know. No cheerful music accompanied this solemn occasion. No celebration brightened the somber faces of the assembled family members. Only the wind spoke, moaning through the crooked trees that encircled the Walker property like silent sentinels. Elijah Walker stood beside her, a mountain of a man with calloused hands and eyes that revealed nothing, her cousin, her husband. The thought made Clara's stomach twist into knots. She was 9 years old, still collecting pretty stones from the creek bed just yesterday, still climbing apple trees when no one was watching. Today, tradition had transformed her into something else entirely. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher concluded, snapping his Bible shut with finality. The weight of expectation pressed down on Clara's thin shoulders like a shroud, suffocating any protest before it could form on her lips. Afterward, the Walker women descended upon her in a flurry of faded cotton dresses and weathered hands. Aunt Meredith squeezed her arm with bony fingers, her smile never reaching her eyes. "You'll learn to be content," she whispered, the words hanging between them like a half-truth. Cousin Beatrice patted her head mechanically, while her own mother stood at a distance, gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the gathering. It was Hester Walker who approached last, her face a careful mask as she straightened Clara's collar. "Remember to breathe," she murmured, so quietly that only Clara could hear. Something flickered in Hester's eyes, a warning, perhaps, or a shared pain that Clara couldn't yet comprehend. The women's faces all held secrets they'd never dare speak aloud, their hollow smiles concealing generations of silent submission. Clara recognized the same distant look mirrored in each pair of eyes, a resignation that chilled her more than Elijah's stern presence. For Clara Walker, childhood ended not with celebration or natural passage, but with a whisper and a vow she never chose. As the family dispersed toward the house for a modest meal, she took her first steps into a life predetermined by others, the valley's traditions closing around her like an invisible cage. Days melted together like wax, each indistinguishable from the last. Clara Walker's small hands grew raw and chapped from scrubbing clothes in water so cold it burned. Winter in Whitford Valley showed no mercy, especially to a 9-year-old expected to maintain a household. The iron stove became both enemy and friend, its heat essential yet temperamental, demanding constant attention as she fed it wood throughout the bitter Appalachian days. "The corners need scrubbing again," Elijah would announce, inspecting her work with cold eyes that missed nothing. Her cousin and husband never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His disappointment carried weight enough to crush her slender shoulders. The wooden house itself seemed alive with secrets. Each floorboard protested under her steps, groaning as if carrying the weight of all the Walker women who had walked this same path before her. Sometimes, in the quiet afternoons, when Elijah was tending to family business, Clara would press her ear to the walls, certain she could hear whispers, stories trapped in the timber, warnings she couldn't quite understand. Her world contracted daily. The boundaries of the valley became the boundaries of her existence. Mountains that had once seemed like adventures waiting to happen now loomed as impassable walls. The creek, where she had once played, became merely a source of water for washing. The woods transformed from a playground into a dark reminder of how small her life had become. Sundays brought no relief, only a different kind of confinement. The tiny church at the valley center filled with Walkers, aunts, uncles, cousins, all bearing the same surname, their features echoing one another in unsettling ways. Clara would sit rigid in the hard pew, sandwiched between Elijah and her mother, whose eyes never quite met her daughter's anymore. The preacher's words washed over them all, but what Clara noticed most was the silence, how no one ever questioned, how every head nodded in unison, how every voice recited the same prayers with the same cadence. It was as if the entire clan had been rehearsing the same performance for generations. After services, the women gathered while men discussed crops and weather. Clara watched her female relatives, their movements so similar they seemed choreographed, their conversations never straying beyond acceptable topics. She caught Hester watching her once, a flash of something like pity in her older cousin's eyes before she turned away. That night, Lying on her thin mattress, Clara felt something settle into her bones. A dull, persistent ache she couldn't name. Not quite sadness, not quite fear, but something deeper. The repetition of days, the sameness of faces, the echo of her own last name, repeated endlessly throughout the valley. All of it was becoming part of her, like the dirt under her fingernails that never quite washed clean. One morning, Clara Walker sat rigid in the hard wooden pew, surrounded by family members whose faces blurred together after weeks of forced familiarity. The church's musty air hung heavy with dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through small windows. As the congregation rose for the third hymn, Clara felt a presence shift beside her. Hester Walker, her older cousin with knowing eyes and calloused hands, leaned in close. Her breath tickled Clara's ear as she whispered words that would haunt the child for days to come. "You remind me of the first." The statement slithered into Clara's mind, unsettling and heavy with implication. Before the 9-year-old could gather her courage to ask what Hester meant, the older woman straightened and resumed singing, her voice blending with the others as if nothing significant had passed between them. Clara tried to catch her cousin's eye throughout the remainder of the service, but Hester deliberately avoided her gaze. When the final prayer ended and the congregation began to disperse, the older cousin melted into the crowd of walkers filing out of the church, leaving Clara alone with her confusion and growing unease. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay on the thin mattress beside Elijah, careful not to disturb his slumber, while her mind churned with possibilities. The first what? The first bride? The first child to be married off? The first to question the valley's ways? From that day forward, Clara watched her family with new eyes, noticing patterns everyone else seemed determined to ignore. She observed how conversations between the women would halt abruptly when certain topics arose, how they communicated in half-sentences and meaningful glances. She saw how silence filled the gaps where stories should be, creating voids no one dared to fill with truth. During family gatherings, Clara began to notice the fear that flickered in the glances passed between women, her mother, aunts, and cousins. Whenever a young girl was mentioned or when marriage arrangements were discussed, their eyes would dart toward each other, carrying messages Clara couldn't fully decipher but instinctively understood contained warnings. She started counting the women in the valley, mentally noting their ages and relationships. Many seemed to have arrived from elsewhere, yet none ever spoke of homes beyond Whitford Valley. Clara realized with growing discomfort that while the men proudly traced their Walker lineage back generations, the women's histories remained conspicuously absent, as if their lives before the valley held no significance. The mystery of the first became a splinter in Clara's mind, impossible to ignore, painful to probe, yet somehow vital to understanding her own precarious position in this family of secrets and shadows. Behind the barn, Clara Walker discovered a peculiar patch of earth where nothing grew. Unlike the rest of the property that sprouted weeds even in the harshest conditions, this spot remained barren, a perfect rectangle of dead soil that seemed to repel life itself. The 9-year-old often found herself drawn to this strange anomaly, feeling an inexplicable pull whenever she passed nearby during her daily chores. One afternoon, while hanging laundry on the line, she noticed how the wind behaved oddly around the patch. It would shift and swirl, as if the air itself were reluctant to pass over that particular spot. Clara knelt down, reaching out to touch the soil, when a shadow fell across her small frame. "Not your place, Clara," Elijah Walker's voice cut through the air, sharp as winter frost. Her cousin-husband stood with arms crossed, his weathered face set in familiar lines of disapproval. "You've got washing to finish." The young girl nodded obediently, rising to her feet with practiced quickness. She had learned early that questioning him only brought trouble. As she retreated to her chores, she felt his eyes boring into her back, watching until she disappeared around the corner of the family house. That night, Clara sat by the kitchen window, pretending to mend one of Elijah's shirts. The iron stove still radiated heat from dinner, casting flickering shadows across the worn floorboards. Outside, darkness had settled over Whitford Valley like a heavy blanket, but the thin crescent moon provided just enough light for her to keep watch. Shortly after midnight, she saw him. Elijah emerged from the back door, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The thin child pressed herself against the wall, making herself invisible as he passed by the window. He moved with purpose toward the barn, his silhouette disappearing into the night. Clara counted to 100 before creeping to the window again. She watched as her husband knelt by the barren patch, digging with focused determination. Whatever ritual he performed there took nearly an hour before he finally stood, brushing dirt from his knees. When Elijah returned to the house, Clara was already back in her bed, eyes closed in feigned sleep. She heard him washing at the basin, the sound of water splashing as he scrubbed his hands with unusual thoroughness. Through barely opened eyes, she observed mud caking his boots by the door, the same boots that would leave mysterious tracks through the kitchen on countless mornings to come. In the days that followed, Clara began noticing patterns. Elijah would disappear on nights when the household was particularly tense, or after receiving certain visitors from deeper in the valley. Each time he returned with that same shadow in his eyes, a darkness that seemed to hollow him out from within. Winter tightened its grip on Whitford Valley, transforming the landscape into a prison of ice and shadow. The nights stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the creaking of the old house as it contracted in the bitter cold. Clara Walker's days blurred together, endless chores, silent meals, and the weight of Elijah's watchful gaze following her every movement. The iron stove became her only companion, its warmth a fleeting comfort as she prepared meals and washed dishes with hands chapped raw from cold water. Each evening, she would stare out the frost-covered windows toward the mountains, wondering what lay beyond their imposing silhouette. One particularly harsh evening, as Clara finished hanging the laundry indoors, she felt something crinkle in her apron pocket. Glancing over her shoulder to ensure Elijah wasn't nearby, she slipped her fingers inside and extracted a small, folded scrap of paper. Her heart quickened as she carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. "Don't wait for the frost. If you can, take the North Trail and run." No signature, but Clara immediately recognized Hester's distinctive penmanship, the same slant to the letters she'd noticed when her older cousin had written down a recipe months ago. Clara's hands trembled as she read the words again. The North Trail. She knew it vaguely, a seldom-used path that wound through the densest part of the woods before eventually leading away from the valley. In summer, it might be navigable, but now, buried under snow and ice. Footsteps on the porch sent panic through her veins. She quickly stuffed the note back into her pocket just as her husband entered, stomping snow from his boots. Elijah's face was hard as stone, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Who were you talking to earlier?" he demanded, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "No one," Clara answered, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Just singing to myself while I worked." That night, after Elijah's breathing had deepened into sleep, Clara carefully retrieved the note from her apron and slid it beneath her thin mattress. The paper felt impossibly heavy with promise and danger. Her fingers lingered on its edge, mind racing with questions. How many others had received similar messages? Had anyone ever successfully escaped? What happened to those who tried and failed? The old woman at the valley's edge had tried once and been brought back. What price had she paid? Clara stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. Somewhere in another part of the sprawling Walker property, Hester was risking everything by reaching out. The young bride closed her eyes, imagining footprints in snow, leading away from Whitford Valley toward freedom, wondering if they would ever be hers. The first signs of spring arrived in Whitford Valley, bringing with it the squelch of mud beneath boots and unfamiliar voices that carried on the warming breeze. Clara Walker watched from the kitchen window as a traveling merchant's wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of their property. Such visitors were rare in the valley, where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and family kept to themselves. The merchant, a weathered man with kind eyes, spread his wares on a makeshift table, trinkets that glittered in the afternoon sun, fabrics with colors Clara had never seen, and small treasures from beyond the mountains. She slipped outside, drawn by curiosity, despite knowing Elijah would disapprove. "Just looking won't hurt," she whispered to herself, fingers tracing the edge of her worn apron as she approached. The merchant greeted her with a smile that faltered when he truly saw her face. His eyes narrowed, head tilting slightly as recognition flickered across his features. "I swear I've seen a girl just like you," he said slowly. "Years ago, through the mountain pass, same eyes, same way of standing, could have been your sister." Clara's heart quickened. Before she could respond, Elijah Walker appeared beside her, his hand firm on her shoulder. "We don't need anything today," her cousin husband said curtly. "Best be on your way before dark." The merchant nodded, understanding the dismissal in Elijah's tone, but his eyes lingered on Clara's face a moment longer. "Strange coincidence," he murmured, before Elijah steered the conversation toward the weather and upcoming harvest. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The merchant's words echoed in her mind like pebbles dropped in a still pond. Ripples disturbing what she thought she knew. Had there been others who looked like her, girls who had perhaps escaped the valley's grasp? She rolled onto her side, staring at the wall where moonlight cast shadows through the window. If someone had left before, someone who resembled her enough to cause a stranger to comment, maybe there was hope. Maybe the North Trail Hester had mentioned in her note wasn't just a fantasy. For the first time since her marriage, Clara allowed herself to imagine a different life beyond the hills. She pictured streets filled with people who didn't share her last name, buildings taller than trees, and most importantly, freedom from the weight of tradition that pressed down on her small shoulders. The next morning, as she fetched water from the creek, Clara found herself studying her reflection in the clear surface. Who was that other girl the merchant had seen? Had she found happiness beyond Whitford Valley? The questions bloomed like early spring flowers in her mind, impossible to ignore and, once rooted, impossible to remove. The summer heat descended on Whitford Valley like a thick blanket, turning the air sticky and oppressive. Clara Walker wiped sweat from her brow as she carried a pitcher of lemonade to the gathering of relatives sprawled across the patchy lawn behind the main house. These summer meetings were a Walker tradition, a time when family business was conducted and futures were decided with the casual exchange of nods and handshakes. From the corner of her eye, Clara observed Elijah Walker deep in conversation with her uncle Tobias, their heads bent close, voices low, despite the distance between them and the rest of the family. The young girl had learned to move quietly, to blend into the background where adults forgot her presence. She set the pitcher down on a rickety table and pretended to arrange cups while straining to hear snippets of nearby conversations. "Been that way since before she was born," an elderly aunt muttered to her neighbor. Elijah lived with her mama for nearly 2 years after the trouble with his own folks. Clara froze, her fingers tightening around a chipped glass. The woman continued, unaware of her eavesdropper. Arrangement was made when Sarah was still carrying old ways. You know, keep the bloodline strong. A cold realization washed over Clara, despite the sweltering heat. Elijah had lived with her mother before she was even born. Their marriage hadn't just been arranged during her childhood. It had been decided before she had taken her first breath. Her entire existence had been mapped out, her future sealed by whispers and handshakes while she was still growing in her mother's womb. She looked across the gathering at her husband, now 32 to her 9 years, and saw him in a new light. Had he watched her grow, knowing all along she would be his? Had he helped name her, feed her, all while waiting for her to reach the age the family deemed appropriate for marriage? The glass trembled in her hand. Clara set it down carefully, fighting the urge to run. Where would she go? The valley walls seemed to close in around her, the family's web of connections stretching to every corner of their isolated world. Hester Walker appeared at her side, taking the pitcher from her unsteady hands. "You look pale," her older cousin remarked, her voice low with concern. "Did you know?" Clara whispered, unable to articulate the full horror of her discovery. Hester's eyes darted toward Elijah, then back to Clara. "We'll talk later," she murmured. "Not here. Too many ears." Clara nodded, composing her face into the blank mask she had perfected over months of marriage. She moved through the gathering, pouring drinks and collecting plates, all while the truth settled into her bones. She had never had a chance at freedom, not for a single day of her life. The drought had turned the creek behind the Walker house to a trickle, forcing Clara Walker to venture farther for water than she'd ever been allowed. With the heavy wooden bucket swinging from her small hands, she followed the dusty path beyond the property line, where the trees grew wilder and the valley's edge met the mountain's shadow. The 9-year-old moved cautiously, aware that every step took her farther from Elijah's watchful gaze. Her yellowed dress caught on brambles as she pushed through overgrown paths, the valley's familiar landscape giving way to unfamiliar territory. Near a bend in the dried-up creek bed, Clara spotted a small cabin she'd never known existed. Smoke curled from its chimney despite the summer heat. As she approached, an elderly woman emerged, her back bent with age but her eyes sharp and knowing. "You're one of them," the woman said, not a question, but a statement. "A Walker girl." Clara nodded, clutching her bucket tighter. "Come fill your pail from my well," the woman offered, gesturing to a stone structure behind her cabin. "I'm Margaret Walker, though nobody calls me that anymore." The girl approached cautiously. "I'm Clara," she replied, omitting her surname since the woman already knew. As Clara lowered the bucket into the cool darkness of the well, Margaret studied her with haunted eyes that seemed to recognize something familiar in the child's face. "You're living in the main house now, aren't you, with Elijah?" The old woman's voice carried a tremor. Clara nodded again, pulling up the water with effort. "I was like you once," Margaret confessed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I tried to leave once. When I was 16, made it all the way to the county line." She gestured vaguely toward the distant hills. "But the family brought me back. They always keep things the same." The water sloshed in Clara's bucket as her hands trembled. "Did they hurt you?" she asked. Margaret's silence was answer enough. After a moment, she added, "The valley has its ways. The Walkers have their rules." Clara felt a strange mixture of hope and dread wash over her. Someone had tried before. Someone had almost made it out. "You best get back before they wonder where you've gone," Margaret warned, glancing nervously at the son's position. "And child, don't tell Elijah you met me. Some branches of the family tree they tried to forget." As Clara trudged home with her heavy burden, the old woman's words echoed in her mind. The valley's grip ran deep, through blood, through memory, through fear. But if Margaret had once found courage to try, perhaps someday, Clara could find a way too. The autumn winds howled through Whitford Valley, rattling the loose window panes of the Walker home. Clara Walker pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she swept the kitchen floor, watching golden leaves dance across the yard. The chill in the air matched the one that had settled in her bones since her marriage to Elijah. It was during this quiet afternoon chore that a shadow fell across the doorway. Clara looked up to find Hester Walker standing there, her usually composed face drawn with worry, eyes darting nervously toward the road as if afraid of being seen. "Hester," Clara whispered, setting aside her broom. She hadn't seen her older cousin in weeks. Hester stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind her. "Is he here?" she asked, voice barely audible above the wind. Clara shook her head. "Hunting. Won't be back until sundown." Relief washed over Hester's face. But only momentarily. She approached Clara, taking the girl's small hands in her own. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice urgent. "Don't go walking with Elijah under the crescent moon. Nothing good happens when the night is thin." The cryptic warning sent a chill through Clara that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She studied her cousin's face, searching for meaning behind the strange words. "What happens during the crescent moon?" she asked. Hester's eyes clouded. "Family business," she replied, echoing the phrase Elijah often used to silence questions. "Just promise me you'll find reasons to stay inside when that moon rises." Clara nodded slowly, uncertain if the warning was about the valley's many superstitions or something darker woven into the Walker family fabric. Either way, the fear in Hester's eyes was real enough. The last girl who walked those hills on such a night. Hester began, then stopped herself, glancing toward the window. "I've said too much already." Before Clara could press for more information, Hester squeezed her hands once more and slipped back out the door, disappearing into the swirling leaves like a ghost. That night, as Elijah cleaned his hunting knife at the kitchen table, Clara noticed him studying the sky through the window. The moon was waxing, growing fuller each night. "Beautiful harvest coming," he remarked, his voice oddly gentle. "In 3 nights. When the moon curves just right, we should walk up to the ridge together. Family tradition." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered Hester's warning. "I've been feeling poorly," she lied, keeping her eyes on the potatoes she was peeling. "Might be coming down with something." Elijah's gaze lingered on her, calculating. 3 nights, he repeated. "You'll feel better by then." Clara nodded automatically, but inside, her mind raced. She would need to plan her movements more carefully now, finding excuses and creating diversions. Whatever secret lurked beneath the crescent moon, she was determined not to discover it firsthand. Clara Walker woke with a start, her thin blanket offering little protection against the biting chill that had crept into the house overnight. The first frost of the season had arrived, painting delicate white patterns across the window panes. Something felt wrong. The air smelled different, earthy and cold, and a draught whispered through the old Walker house that shouldn't have been there. Wrapping herself in a shawl, the 9-year-old padded barefoot across the creaking floorboards. The kitchen door stood wide open, swinging gently on its hinges as the morning breeze pushed against it. Muddy footprints trailed across the wooden floor she had scrubbed clean just yesterday. Leading from the back entrance through the kitchen and disappearing down the hallway toward Elijah's room. On the kitchen table sat something that hadn't been there the night before, a lady's handkerchief, delicately embroidered with unfamiliar initials. Clara picked it up, running her small fingers over the intricate stitching. The fabric was fine, not the rough cotton used by the women in Whitford Valley. It smelled faintly of perfume, a luxury no one in these parts could afford. "Put that down." Elijah's voice cut through the silence, making her jump. Her cousin stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light. His boots were caked with the same mud that marked her clean floor, and dark circles shadowed his eyes as if he hadn't slept. The door was open, Clara said, carefully placing the handkerchief back on the table. And these footprints, I had business to attend to, he interrupted. Crossing to the table and snatching up the embroidered cloth, stuffing it into his pocket. His movements were jerky, agitated. "Whose handkerchief is that?" she asked, her voice small but determined. Elijah's face hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Family business, nothing for you to worry about." He turned away, filling the kettle with water and placing it on the iron stove with unnecessary force. The dismissal was clear, but Clara couldn't let it go. The footprints, the open door, the strange handkerchief, they all connected to something important. Was Hester here? She pressed, thinking of her older cousin's warnings about the crescent moon. "Enough questions," he snapped. "Get to your chores." That night, after Elijah had fallen asleep, Clara crept to the window and stared out at the frost-covered valley. The cryptic answer gnawed at her, fueling suspicions that had been growing for months. The Walker family kept secrets, dark ones that everyone seemed to know but her. She thought about the patch of earth behind the barn where nothing grew, about Hester's warnings, about the stranger looking for a missing girl. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, one that made her stomach twist with dread. Whatever business had brought muddy boots into her kitchen under cover of darkness, she was certain of one thing: the Walker family's secrets were darker than anyone dared admit. The snow had transformed Whitford Valley into a pristine white fortress, isolating the Walker homestead even more than usual. Clara Walker stood at the frost-covered window, her small fingers tracing patterns on the glass, when she spotted an unfamiliar vehicle struggling up the narrow road. Her heart quickened. Visitors were rare, especially in winter. Elijah Walker noticed it too. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice tight with an emotion Clara rarely heard: fear. The stranger was a tall man, in a city coat too thin for mountain weather. He introduced himself as Detective James Harmon, showing a badge that made the family shift uncomfortably. Clara watched from the shadows as the adults gathered in the front room, their bodies forming a protective wall between her and the outsider. "I'm looking for Rebecca Tanner," the detective explained, producing a photograph of a young woman with familiar eyes. Had her family reported her missing 3 months ago? Last anyone heard, she was heading to these parts. The name meant nothing to Clara, but she noticed how her mother's hand trembled slightly as she poured coffee. Elijah's jaw tightened in that way it did when he was holding back words. "Ain't seen no city folk round here," Uncle Jeremiah Walker responded, his voice deliberately thicker with mountain accent than usual. "Especially no young women traveling alone. Wouldn't be proper." The detective's gaze swept across the room, lingering momentarily on Clara before Aunt Martha subtly moved to block his view. "Mind if I look around the property?" he asked. "Got a warrant?" Elijah challenged, standing taller. The tension crackled like the fire in the hearth. Clara slipped behind the kitchen door, listening as the family offered rehearsed politeness while systematically stonewalling every question. The detective eventually left, promising to return with more questions, and perhaps that warrant. As his vehicle disappeared down the snowy road, the family erupted in hushed, urgent conversations. Clara pretended to busy herself with chores, straining to catch fragments. "Could bring trouble. Thought we handled that. Patch behind the barn." Later that night, Clara overheard Elijah speaking with her mother. "We need to be careful. That girl looked too much like—" He stopped abruptly when he noticed Clara in the doorway. For days afterward, whispers followed Clara through the house. The family watched the road nervously, jumped at unexpected sounds. Even Hester avoided her, as if proximity might somehow reveal secrets. Clara felt the walls of their isolated world contracting. Whatever protection the valley's remoteness had provided was crumbling. The outside world had found a crack in their fortress, and light was seeping in, illuminating corners the walkers had kept dark for generations. The first signs of spring breathed life into Whitford Valley, melting the snow that had imprisoned Clara Walker through the long winter months. As the days grew longer, Clara found herself with a rare moment alone in the house, Elijah having gone to help with repairs at his uncle's farm. She seized the opportunity to explore the attic, a forbidden space she'd been warned away from countless times. The wooden steps creaked beneath her feet as she climbed, dust dancing in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through tiny cracks in the roof. In the corner sat an ancient trunk, its leather straps cracked with age. Clara's heart pounded as she lifted the heavy lid, revealing layers of family history tucked away from prying eyes. Beneath yellowed newspapers and moth-eaten blankets, her fingers brushed against something soft. She pulled out a faded hair ribbon. Identical to the one her mother had given her on her 7th birthday, the similarity was uncanny, the same pattern, the same frayed edges, as if they had been cut from the same cloth. "This can't be mine," she whispered to herself, turning it over in her palm. Digging deeper, Clara discovered a small, leather-bound diary wedged between folded linens. The spine cracked as she opened it, revealing handwriting that mirrored her own in an eerie way. The same loops and curves. But not quite her hand. The first entry read, "They say I'll learn to love him, but how can anyone love their jailer?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through pages filled with familiar desperation, accounts of daily chores, whispered conversations, and growing plans for escape. "The North Trail leads past the old quarry," one entry explained. "If I leave before the first frost, I might make it to Ridgeton before anyone notices I'm gone." But the diary ended abruptly. Several pages had been violently torn out, leaving jagged edges like broken promises. Clara ran her finger along the torn paper, wondering what fate had befallen the writer. Had she escaped, or had the family caught her, erasing her rebellion from their carefully maintained history? The sound of a slamming door downstairs jolted Clara back to reality. She quickly returned everything to the trunk except the diary, which she tucked into the waistband of her skirt, hidden beneath her blouse. That night, by candlelight, she read every remaining word, searching for clues. The similarities were too striking to ignore. Another young bride, another walker, trapped in the same cycle of tradition and control. The missing pages haunted her dreams, filled with imagined endings both hopeful and tragic. Someone had tried this path before her, and the family had methodically erased their story. But they hadn't been thorough enough. This forgotten voice from the past had just handed Clara Walker the most precious gift of all, proof that she wasn't alone in her desire to break free. Clara Walker's days had become a carefully choreographed dance between what she showed the world and what she harbored within. Each morning, she'd rise before dawn, stoke the iron stove with practiced movements, and prepare Elijah's breakfast exactly as he preferred, all while her mind calculated and planned. The weight of her circumstances pressed heavier with each passing day, the conflict between expected obedience and desperate yearning for freedom growing sharper like a knife's edge. "You're quieter than usual," Elijah remarked one evening, his eyes narrowing with suspicion as he watched her mend his work shirt. "Just tired," she replied, careful to keep her voice steady. Her eyes appropriately downcast. The 9-year-old had learned that looking too directly at her cousin-husband often invited unwanted scrutiny. Behind her placid expression, Clara was mapping his habits with meticulous attention. Elijah Walker left every Tuesday at precisely 8 in the morning to meet with other men from the family. He always returned smelling of tobacco and secrets by mid-afternoon. On Fridays, he checked the property boundaries, a task that took him away from the house for nearly 2 hours. These precious windows of absence had become the foundation of her silent rebellion. She discovered that the floorboard beneath the kitchen window creaked loudly, but the one by the back door remained silent. She learned which path through the woods remained dry even after heavy rain, and how to move through the house without casting shadows beneath doors. Each detail was a potential lifeline. Carefully memorized and hidden away, the valley itself seemed to conspire against escape. Neighbors watched each other with casual vigilance disguised as friendliness. Children reported unusual sightings to parents. Even the road leading out twisted confusingly through dense forest before reaching anything resembling civilization. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, Clara noticed Hester watching her from beyond the fence line. Her older cousin made a subtle gesture toward the creek before disappearing into the trees. That night, Clara lay awake, counting Elijah's breaths until they deepened into sleep. Only then did she silently retrieve the note Hester had hidden beneath a rock by the water's edge. "The preacher leaves his truck unlocked on Sundays," it read in Hester's cramped handwriting. "Keys above the visor." Clara swallowed hard. Committing the words to memory before burning the paper in the stove's dying embers. Knowledge was power, but in Whitford Valley, it was also dangerous. She was learning to survive not just through obedience, but through observation, gathering the fragments of possibility that might someday form a path to freedom. Clara Walker's days grew increasingly difficult, as Elijah's watchful eyes seemed to follow her every movement. His suspicion had been aroused by small things, a lingering glance toward the hills, a question about the world beyond their valley, or simply standing too long at the edge of their property. The geography of Whitford Valley itself conspired against her, with its steep ridges and dense forests, creating a natural prison that had contained generations of walkers before her. "Where were you this morning?" Elijah demanded one evening, his voice sharp as a knife. Clara had only ventured to the creek, searching for a possible route, but his tone made her stomach tighten with fear. "Just washing," she answered, eyes downcast, the lie bitter on her tongue. The bruise on her wrist the next day served as a reminder of the cost of curiosity. It wasn't the first mark he'd left, nor would it be the last. Each time she tested the boundaries, punishment followed, sometimes physical, sometimes the crushing weight of isolation as he forbade her from attending church or family gatherings. Yet something inside Clara refused to break. While scrubbing clothes at the creek, she discovered a narrow path hidden by overhanging branches. During errands to fetch water, she memorized the contours of the land, noting which trails the deer took through the underbrush. When sent to gather kindling, she ventured a little farther each time, mapping the forest in her mind. "You remind me of someone," the old woman at the valley's edge told her when Clara brought her a basket of cornbread. "Someone who watched and waited just like you." Clara stored every scrap of information like precious gems. She learned that on the first Sunday of each month, Elijah met with the elders after service, leaving the house empty for nearly 2 hours. She discovered a shallow crossing at the creek's bend, where the water barely reached her knees. She found a hollowed tree where she could hide small provisions, a jar of preserved fruit, a spare handkerchief, a box of matches. Each night, Clara lay awake planning, calculating distances and timing, weighing risks against the suffocating certainty of her future if she remained. The diary pages she'd found haunted her dreams, another girl's interrupted escape plan, another life swallowed by the valley's hungry traditions. "Now the North Trail floods in spring," Hester whispered during a rare moment alone, "but stays dry through fall." Clara nodded, storing this vital piece of information alongside all the others, building her map to freedom, one dangerous fragment at a time. Hester Walker's presence in Clara's life had become like the flickering shadows cast by the iron stove, sometimes warming, sometimes fading, but always essential. Each whispered warning or hastily scribbled note represented a lifeline in Clara's increasingly isolated existence. When Hester slipped Clara an extra biscuit during Sunday gatherings or caught her eye across the church pews with a subtle nod, these small gestures sustained the 9-year-old through her darkest moments. "They'll notice if we talk too much," Hester had murmured one afternoon while they collected water from the creek. "Elijah watches everything." The older cousin's hands trembled slightly as she filled her pail, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "I've helped others before you." Clara absorbed these cryptic statements, storing them away like precious seeds. But each time Hester offered these fragments of hope, she would inevitably withdraw for weeks afterward, leaving Clara to navigate the suffocating routines of the household alone. The pattern was becoming familiar. Hester would approach with information, then retreat into silence, as though testing the waters of her own courage. The mystery of the city man continued to haunt the valley. Clara overheard snippets of conversation when the family thought she wasn't listening. "He's back in town asking questions again," one of the uncles had muttered during a gathering. The room had fallen silent, eyes darting nervously toward Elijah, who stood by the window with his jaw clenched tight. "That girl's been gone 3 years now," someone else had whispered. "Why can't they just let it be?" Clara pieced together the fragments like a quilt. A missing girl, the stranger's persistent questions, the family's collective anxiety. Sometimes at night she would lie awake, wondering if the missing girl had worn a yellow dress like hers, if she too had stood on the sagging porch, watching for a chance to flee. One evening, Clara found Hester alone in the kitchen, staring at the handkerchief that had appeared months earlier. "Was she like me?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Hester's fingers froze on the embroidered cloth. "She was braver," she finally answered, "or maybe just more desperate." She quickly tucked the handkerchief away when footsteps approached the door. The truth hovered just beyond Clara's grasp, like trying to catch fireflies with bare hands. Each time she thought she understood the pattern of secrets woven through the Walker family, the threads would shift and tangle anew. But one thing remained certain. Whatever had happened to the missing girl, the family feared its discovery more than anything else. Seasons changed, and Clara Walker learned to move quietly, to fade into the background while plotting her escape. She developed a talent for invisibility, pressing herself into shadows when Elijah entered a room, keeping her eyes downcast, but her ears alert. The young bride's silence was no longer submission, but calculation. Each moment of obedience bought her time to plan. She watched the river swell in spring, noting how the current weakened at the bend near the old oak. During her water-fetching chores, Clara memorized the lay of the land, marking which trails the family rarely used and which neighbor might turn a blind eye to a fleeing child. By summer, she had mapped the valley in her mind more thoroughly than any walker before her. "You're quieter these days," her mother observed one evening, hands busy with mending. The woman's face, lined with years of similar resignation, showed a flicker of concern that Clara couldn't afford to trust. Too many times, whispered confidences had found their way to Elijah's ears. "Just tired," Clara replied, the lie coming easier now. Hester visited less frequently as summer faded to autumn, but when she did appear, her messages became more urgent. "The family's watching closer now," she whispered while helping Clara hang laundry. "That city man asking questions has everyone on edge. Be careful." Clara nodded, understanding the warning beneath the words. The missing girl the stranger had sought remained a ghost in conversations, a name never spoken aloud but hanging in the air of the Walker home like dust motes caught in sunlight. At night, Clara practiced packing, mentally selecting what little she could carry, what she would need to survive. The diary pages she'd found became her talisman, evidence that someone before her had been brave enough to try. She kept the faded hair ribbon tucked inside her shoe, a constant reminder of what was possible. The stakes were impossibly high. One misstep would cost her Hester's protection, her mother's fragile trust, even her own tenuous sense of belonging. For despite everything, the valley was the only home she'd known, and the Walkers, with all their secrets and silence, were her blood. But when she caught Elijah watching her with narrowed eyes as she studied the horizon too long, Clara knew her window was closing. The family could sense rebellion like animals scent a storm. She would have one chance, perhaps less, and timing would determine everything. So she waited, counting the days until the family gathering that would take them beyond the valley's edge, beyond the invisible boundary that had contained her entire world. The autumn harvest festival in neighboring Glenwood required extra hands, and for the first time in months, Clara Walker saw an opportunity forming like a crack in a prison wall. Elijah Walker initially refused, his jaw set in that familiar, immovable way. "The women from our family never go," he stated flatly, cleaning mud from his boots on the porch steps. Clara nodded submissively, eyes downcast. "I understand. But Hester mentioned they need help with the preserves. I've gotten good at it this year." She paused, carefully selecting her words. "People will notice if the Walkers don't contribute properly." The mention of family reputation struck the right chord. After 3 days of careful negotiation, with promises of absolute obedience and proper behavior, Elijah relented. Clara felt her heart race beneath her calm exterior as she packed a small bag, including the faded hair ribbon she'd found in the trunk, her talisman of courage. The journey to Glenwood took 4 hours by automobile, with Elijah driving in stony silence. Clara memorized every turn, every landmark, knowing this knowledge might save her life. When they arrived at the community hall, the bustle of preparation provided perfect cover. "Stay where I can see you," Elijah instructed, before joining the men setting up tables. Clara worked diligently among the women, stirring enormous pots of apple butter, arranging jars of pickled vegetables. She waited until midday, when Elijah became engrossed in a heated discussion about property boundaries with other men from the valley. Slipping through the back door, she walked, not ran, toward the eastern edge of Glenwood, where her mother once mentioned distant Walker cousins lived. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each step, expecting Elijah's hand on her shoulder at any moment. The modest house sat back from the road, surrounded by oak trees. When Martha Walker opened the door, her eyes widened in recognition, though they'd never met. "You're one of the Valley Walkers," she said. Not a question, but a statement laden with understanding. Clara nodded. "I need somewhere to stay, just for a while." Martha glanced behind Clara, then at her thin frame and desperate eyes. "You're running from them?" "Yes." The older woman hesitated only briefly before stepping aside. "We don't associate with the Valley branch anymore. There's reasons for that." Inside, Clara made her offer. She would work, remain invisible, never cause trouble. In exchange, they would never mention her presence to anyone from Whitford Valley. As darkness fell, Clara knew Elijah would be searching, his anger building with each passing hour. But for the first time since she could remember, she took a breath that felt entirely her own. The price of freedom was steep. Clara Walker had traded her family bonds for safety, leaving behind not just Whitford Valley, but every face she had known since birth. The distant relatives who took her in lived 3 counties away, far enough that the Walker family's reach couldn't easily extend, yet close enough that she sometimes imagined she could smell the valley's distinct mix of pine and wood smoke on certain windy days. Her mother's absence carved a hollow space inside her chest. At night, Clara would trace the outline of the faded hair ribbon she had smuggled out, wondering if her mother had ever suspected her plans or secretly hoped for her escape. There would be no letters, no visits. The price of leaving was complete severance. The relatives who sheltered her asked few questions. They had their own whispered stories about the Walker clan, tales passed between worried glances when they thought Clara couldn't hear. They enrolled her in the local school, where she learned to answer to just Clara, dropping the surname that linked her to the valley. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, guilt would wash over her like the creek water after spring rains. Had her departure simply created a vacuum that would pull another young girl into Elijah's orbit? The thought of another child bride standing on that sagging porch made her physically ill. She imagined Hester Walker trying to protect another girl, slipping notes and warnings while risking her own safety. "You can't save everyone," her new guardian had told her once, noticing how Clara stared at newspaper headlines about missing children. The woman didn't know the specific demons Clara fought, but she recognized the weight of responsibility too heavy for young shoulders. Clara found small ways to heal. She planted a garden, watching seeds transform into something new and hopeful. She kept a journal, complete as with no torn pages, recording her memories so that nothing would be erased. And she studied maps, learning the geography beyond the valley's confining hills. One day, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single line in handwriting she recognized as Hester's. The frost came, but no new flowers were planted. Clara understood the coded message. No new child bride had taken her place. Perhaps her absence had indeed disrupted the cycle, forcing even Elijah to reconsider the family's traditions. That night, Clara slept without nightmares for the first time in months. Her escape hadn't just saved her. It had created a small crack in the foundation of the Walker family's control, and cracks, given time and pressure, could bring down even the most entrenched structures. Each memory of the valley came with the scent of wood smoke, the sting of winter wind, the hush of secrets behind closed doors. Clara Walker carried these sensations with her like phantom limbs, present even in their absence. Years after her escape, she would sometimes wake in the night, heart racing, convinced she could hear Elijah's heavy footsteps on creaking floorboards. The city that had once seemed an impossible dream became her sanctuary. Clara found work in a small cafe where customers never questioned her past or noticed how she flinched when men raised their voices. Her new life was built on small victories, learning to read without hiding the books, speaking her mind without fear of punishment. Wearing clothes that hadn't belonged to someone else first, she never forgot the lessons learned in silence, to observe, to question, to wait for the right moment. These skills, honed in captivity, served her well in freedom. Clara watched people with the same careful attention she had once given to Elijah's moods, reading intentions in the smallest gestures, anticipating needs before they were voiced. Sometimes she caught glimpses of her old life in unexpected places. A woman with hands like Hester's would pass on the street, and Clara would follow her for blocks before realizing her mistake. The scent of pine after rain would transport her instantly to the patch of dead earth behind the barn, where she now understood something or someone lay buried. She wrote letters to her mother that were never sent, filling pages with the words she wished she could say. Clara wondered if the woman understood what she had condemned her daughter to. If she ever questioned the traditions that had bound them all. These letters became a diary of their own, a record of healing and hurt intertwined. In her 25th year, Clara received news from a distant cousin who had also managed to leave. The valley was changing. After her disappearance, questions had arisen that couldn't be silenced. The city man had returned with authorities. Elijah was gone. Whether imprisoned or fled, the cousin couldn't say. Other young girls had been removed from similar arrangements. In the end, her victory was not a dramatic escape, but a slow, patient unraveling of the bonds that had held her down. One girl's refusal had pulled at a thread that, when tugged, revealed the fragility of the whole tapestry. Clara never returned to Whitford Valley, but she kept a small jar of its soil on her windowsill, not as a memento of captivity, but as a reminder that even the most entrenched traditions could be uprooted, and in her absence, the valley would never be the same.